Hi, welcome to the Caro Kann formation. I have chosen to show it from the black perspective, perhaps a little bit honoring that actually it is a black opening, right? Well, the Caro Kann is something you choose to play with black. The general thing when I see this from black is my first thought is black is just incredibly solid. And that, I guess, has something to do with the soundness of this pawn structure, right? Well, we can see huge solidity on the flanks and then some kind of central influence with pawns on c6 and e6. And we will also have an open d file, which typically is very useful from a sort of defensive perspective. Sure, white has more space. We cannot argue against that. But what we can do is, well, put rooks in the d file and start undermining with c5. And then basically the space advantage will disappear. If we talk about my, let's say, mental image of a extremely generic Caro Kann structure like this, it will probably be that there's not going to be a weak bishop on c8. Ideally, we will have it as a good piece on f5 because we managed to put it on f5 and only then play the move e6. That is sort of the healthy Caro Kann structure where we just talk about black being solid and fine. Perhaps more interesting is when, you know, the bishop gets locked in here. This we will see in some games where it goes first pretty wrong for black, later it goes pretty well, and that becomes more murky and difficult, I would say. So I think what I'm hinting at is that while, let's say, Isolani positions, it's more defined where the pieces goes. Here in the Caro Kann structure, it really depends. And for instance, is the bishop inside or outside of the pawn chain? Make a huge difference in terms of both, let's say, speed, but also how you plan things, where your king is safe, and so on and so forth. But hopefully we will manage to cover these things. If we look at it from the white perspective, well, yeah, we're going to be happy that we have more space, right? And, well, it's simple. We will hide our king somewhere, or mainly because of our extra space. It's not really going to be in trouble, but let's use the e-file for something. Maybe we will jump with a knight to e5 and start attacking like this. It's really going to depend, I would argue. I mean, like, let's say with isolated pawns or hanging pawns, as we have had covered previously, endings will quite often favor the defender. I think here endings are typically just going to be very equalish and drawish. In general, this is a more balanced structure than the previous chapters, but I think I would argue that the default in this structure is balance, but most of the examples in this chapter is actually exceptions where one side managed to really get well, either an actual attack going or more a strategical attack. So it's not a dead draw. It can be at times, but quite often it really sort of springs to life. So I think the Caro Kann structure is also a very popular structure, important to understand. And it's also a structure that, while named after the Caro Kann, it perhaps even more often comes from other openings. So it's also a very general structure, which makes a lot of sense understanding, even if you either don't play 1e4, or if you never play the Caro Kann, it doesn't matter. It's the name of the structure. It's not purely related at all to the opening. So, well, I hope you will come along and look at the example games here, and will find this structure interesting, despite its reputation of being just incredibly solid. I think quite fittingly, we are going to start off the Caro Kann structure chapter with a real Caro Kann. I mean, the Caro Kann structure will arise from a lot of openings, but of course, by default, it comes from the Caro Kann, right? This position is quite interesting. It's a game from 2012 between Akopian and Shimanov, but this position mainly became famous due to some Kasparov-Karpov debates. Well, we see, I mean, very typically the Caro Kann structure. White has more space, but black's structure is incredibly solid. Well, that basically sums up the Caro Kann structure, right? So what's the problem for black? Perhaps it is that, well, where is this king gonna find safety? I guess the answer to that question is depends. But well, with this Caro kind of structure, solidity also comes somewhat a lack of space. And if your king is not safe, maybe you lack some coordination to sort of well. The lack of space means you have more difficulties coordinating a good defense from your king. The game explains it brilliantly. I was almost tempted to start the game move earlier, so I didn't have to explain the next thing with Kasparov and Karpov. But I thought it's essential to understand it. But it feels so counterintuitive to me. Well, what happens in the game is the move knight f6, right? It hits the queen. I would argue, we are developing the knight with tempo. Just sounds great, right? Now they have to move the queen somewhere. The problem is that it's just flawed. What Karpov understood was that b6 is the right move. Well, you want to develop your bishop to b7, and you want to stay flexible. You can always attack with knight f6 next, being the point. But the critical move then was the move queen g4. It attacks the weak pawn on g7. And dealing with that is not so simple. Well, we can castle, but then bishop takes h6 means we have to resign, basically. That doesn't work. Someone was trying g5, and the idea is that after queen... the problem is that after queen h3, there is the threat of bishop takes g5 because there is a pin in the h-line and the rook is going to be hanging on h8. So that was not very successful either. So what did black do? They played the move king to f8. Well, what do you want me to say? It works. And why is it really safe to have the king on f8? I think they were describing at the time as a kind of half move. But, well, the king has some decent kind of safety there. And, well, sometimes the king would go to g8 to make it even safer, or it might return to e7 under circumstances. It is a very unique position in terms of that it actually quite works, and works surprisingly well. I think white started to look almost for different concepts to challenge black here. I mean, I think modern games started to do something like b3, bishop b7, bishop b2, and now you started jumping with the knight. And after something like this, knight d5, and you exploit the square here on f4, and well, also you would be able to push c5 at some point. I mean, how can it be that a king is actually safer on f8 than on g8? Well, to understand that, I think our model game explains this extremely well. So let's see how the king can be really stuck after castling. So Shimanov plays knight to f6, queen goes to h4, and now the move b6. Now Akopyan's next move is excellent. He goes bishop to g5. I think it's important to sort of describe what happens after rook e1. I think our author mentions that after bishop b7, knight e5. I guess at first sight we will think, well, everything is developed nicely, right? I mean, we have a strong knight on e5, and well, our pieces are in good positions. But here actually black can just do long castle, and the king is actually pretty happy on c8. Maybe we even be able to play g5 and get some kind of counterplay. We can have rooks here, and we're also going to push our pawns, right? While for white, well, of course, there is some concept of playing a4, let's say, follow up by a5 and trying to open some lines. And that can also be dangerous. But it's already a very decent situation for black. So for here, the king got into safety. But Akopyan is a very strong player, and he plays the move bishop to g5. I don't know how familiar you are with Vladimir Akopyan. I mean, he became the world junior champion in my youth. I played in the tournament, which he won. And, well, he was a great talent back then, and also managed to be part of the Armenian team for several Olympic goals. So, I mean, a very, very strong player, but I don't think his focus was fully on chess. And like me, he's crossed 50 now, so his chess is not his main focal point, is my impression. But a very, very talented player, and we see it well in this game. So bishop goes to g5. Now the idea is to, attack this knight. I said before that black managed to develop it to a better square, but the problem is it's the worst square. And already now, black is feeling some kind of discomfort. On d7, the knight was safely hidden away, and it had the potential to hit the queen, but here it's hit it too quickly. And by bishop g5, it means that, well, you can't go bishop b7, right? Because of a takes. Well, you cannot castle long castle because it's illegal, and the rook is going to be hanging here. And should you go rook g8, another pawn might drop at some point on h6. It's not really going to work. So Shimanov played bishop e7, and now, well, you can argue that black still has this Caro-Kann solidity, right? The bishop can go to b7, but it's going to be very, very cramped, as we will see. And while this structure, well, the general understanding is it's very solid. But of course, it lacks some space, and if you have too many pieces behind them, if you cannot develop sort of naturally, if you can't get your king into safety, then the space disadvantage really starts to tell. So bishop f4, attacking the queen, chooses to go to d8. I think in this position, perhaps there was a very good option of bailing out, and while an ending like this, you can argue, is not very pleasant, then it's still, it's still, I would say, much less worse than what happens in the game. Maybe there is an interesting desperado situation. White could take on b6 with the idea that you can take here next, but black can take on f2, and after something like this, well, I think the same argument. After knight e5, white is still considerably better. There is threats here and there, but somehow it seems that with f6, you can't really take the pawn due to something like bishop b7, so white should play probably knight to g6 with a pleasant position. Black is very much in the area of trying to limit damage, and while this is very much no fun, it's going to be long kind of defensive work ahead. The problem is what happens is just going to be a short miniature. So black goes queen to d8, and well, I can make the usual argument. There is the solidity, but there is way too much sort of white initiative, and black is way too confined space-wise. So this is crossing the line. Knight e5 happens, bishop b7, rook comes to d1, and the problem is that you can't play castling because bishop takes h6 is just gonna win. We saw something similar in the hanging pawn structures. That, I mean, this pawn on h6 actually can be a severe weakness, especially with a queen sort of getting up to here. The problem is also, well, you can't really live without it. If your bishop comes to g5 with a pawn on h7, there is the threat of taking on f6 and giving mate on h7. So in general, well, this whole concept of having a castled with a queen on h4 with bishops like this can be very dangerous. Shimanov tried bishop to d6, rook e1, queen e7, and now I think a very high-level move by Akopian. Black is sort of getting ready to do long castle. It's not like long castle would mean that black has a great position. It means that black has a chance of surviving, and well, white could flick in a4 or something like this to attack. But Akopian's move is much stronger. It's a very nice prophylactical move. It's queen to h3. It simply has the focus on stopping long castle, because then I think there is this nice move, knight to g6, and if you take it, rook takes e6, spells disaster. There is problem here, the queen is hanging right, and so will the bishop on d6. So this is basically game over. So queen h3, I think a very instructive move. And well, if the black king cannot hide on c8, what's he supposed to do? He tried knight d5, bishop g3, and well, same again. Long castle, knight g6 takes, rook takes e6 is game over. And even if you go knight f6, then also knight g6 takes, rook takes c6 wins. So after bishop to g3, Shimanov decided, okay, let me just castle and see if I can defend it in any way. c4 pushes the knight back, and well, you could avoid the sort of tactic that he get hit by taking on e5, takes knight f6. But after something like rook e3, I think one should not describe it as white has a promising initiative. One should say that white is just completely winning. The rook is gonna come to g3, and this is much more than the black king can take. Right? We have everything pointing at it, and there's no reasonable way to defend here. So Shimanov tried knight f6, and I would say the next move is as a nice finishing touch. Bishop h4, it pins like this. There is the threat of knight g4, and there's just nothing you can do. Shimanov played g5, and Akopian took it and played queen h6. Knight g4 was winning immediately, but I think just next is going to be the move knight to g4. And when we remove this knight, there's going to be mate or something along that lines on h7. Well, let's say just something like this, takes, and you give a check, and then you give mate. I think a very nice game by Akopian. Of course, Shimanov managed to somehow tangle himself into an incredibly passive position, and it had a lot to do with understanding this, I would say, Karpov position in the opening. But I think for many, knight f6, like for me, it looks like the very not logical way to develop, but it actually ended up in a horrible situation. Sure, king f8, like Karpov, if you are a genius on Karpov's level, is possible to understand. I think actually that Karpov managed to understand it in sort of pre-computer areas is a huge mental achievement, or chess understanding achievement. But that is, I would say, a very, very specific thing. This position, after let's say knight f6, queen h4, to understand that because black cannot develop freely, especially because he cannot get the king into safety, is a very general theme, and that's sort of I think why it's quite clever. The author chose this game, showing this more general concept, and he chose to focus on the Karpov example, which is much more specific. So I hope that you got some idea of that. While we are praising the Caro Kann structure for its solidity, it's really gonna depend. And if you sort of leave too many pieces on the board, if you just stay solid, but without trying to perhaps release the tension, you could risk ending up on the side of a brutal attacking game like this one. So yeah, be careful out there. We continue the theme of sort of a disclaimer of the solidity of this Caro Kann structure. That, well, if you leave too many pieces on the board, if you stay too passive, things can actually become very, very unpleasant. So basically, continuing the story of, well, sometimes space actually do matter. This is a game between Maciej and Nogueiras from 2013. It's a typical position in the Alyehin's defense, but Alyehin's defense is already giving up quite some space. We see the pawn on d4, and the Caro Kann structure is not fully set up yet, but it will get there eventually. Here, Maciej plays the move h3. It's not the most sort of common, but it's quite reasonable. It basically controls the g4 square. That's sort of later, when circumstances change, black would not be able to play bishop g4 and swap off some things. So game continues g6 and some natural development like this. Well, black would maybe like to, so let's say, play knight to d7 and make some exchanges, but white is not going to oblige. So the knight will drop back to f3, and that's perhaps one scenario when they're having the g4 square covered makes considerable sense. Here, well, black lacks a natural way to develop. In the game, black plays the move bishop e6. Author mentions that, well, you could make a case for bishop f5, but then actually knight c3 is quite a strong move. The point being that should you take here and go knight d7, there is a nice little tactical trick in terms of you take here and then you play the move g4. So you don't take the exchange immediately, because that would leave the e6 square available. But you trap the bishop on f5 now, and next you're going to take on f7. It's actually a somewhat unusual tactic. I'm not sure I've ever seen before. Anyway, that's kind of details. We just want to get to a typical position. So bishop e6, a reasonable move, right? We put the bishop outside of the pawn chain before we go for our Caro-Kann structure. Bishop drops back, knight d7, and again, a typical move. Here, knight goes back to f3. Of course, one could make some kind of argument for, isn't black ahead in development? I mean, 4 pieces are developed, they have castled, and from white's perspective, well, actually only the knight on f3 is not on the back rank. How can we talk about white having a space advantage here when we are so badly developed? Well, it's because of the static nature, I would argue. White is, white will have time to get the pieces out, and then black is going to be cramped. So strangely, somehow, the d4 pawn versus the c6 pawn provides enough stability for white to play in a seemingly passive manner. Of course, for black, it would perhaps make sense now to try and do something active. And I think the author says, well, maybe b5 was the way to do it, to sort of stop any kind of potential like c4 from white, and also at the same time gaining some kind of space on the queen side, and maybe we're going to put the queen on c7. Of course, the bishop on e6 will be floating around a little bit, but after something like knight g4, maybe then we can go knight c7, and the bishop can stand on d5 because we have the pawn on b5 protecting the c4 square. It's somewhat convoluted, but I think, the author has a point. This would be a better way to sort of fight for being less worse than the game is. The game goes knight to c7, and it's of course a little bit saddening, right? But the idea is somewhat to, this bishop on e6 maybe wants to go to d5 and sort of exchange itself. Maciej just starts developing naturally, bishop to g5. Of course, well, this bishop could be pushed back, but I think h6, maybe we go to f4. h6 has weakened the structure. Not only is the pawn on h6 weak, but also the pawn on g6 becomes weaker like this. So it's more like bishop g5 is trying to tempt a weakness, I would say, than it's just allowing black to gain some space. So rook e8 happens, knight to d2, and now bishop d5, sort of quite typical move in some way, right? Simply, in this position, black is struggling from having too many pieces fighting for too little space. So exchanging one of them should generally be seen as a big achievement. But here, white goes c4 and is capable of taking back on f3 with the knight. And despite there has been an exchange of one set of pieces, suddenly also, white has gained a lot of space in the process and managed to get a lot of development in the process. If we compare to earlier, it looked like black was well developed, but white was passive. Now, suddenly, white has all the pieces out and has, if anything, even enlarged the space advantage, right? So, one gets to see that the position we saw before was kind of deceptive in terms that black's activity was non-relevant in all that it could not be turned into something that would kind of neutralize white's space advantage. Here, black goes knight e6, Maciej just drops back. I think, one could stop here, but because, white is just a better pair of bishops, space, etc., etc. But I thought maybe it makes sense to just show a couple of other moves, because a typical question is also quite often, we have the space, but what are we actually going to do about it? And, we have seen the theme perhaps in the hanging pawns structure with a different setup, of course, but even so, that should one look for weaknesses in the black position? Of course, we can say that lack of space is a weakness, but we could also argue that isn't this king a little bit lonely. I mean, these knights are somewhat far away, and should it go? I mean, this knight on d7, if it goes to f6, it leaves the e5 square more vulnerable. So a logical way would be to try and push this pawn. If we do it immediately, I mean, after h4, black gets some counterplay with e5. I think counterplay is the wrong word, but some kind of release. g3 first is quite nice because, well, if you go e5, then they start exchanging, and I mean, I think g3 is a more useful move than h4, which will be floating a little bit around in this position. I think computers suggest something like this. You're going to take the d file, and it's going to be a major edge. So in this position, Maciej played the move g3 first, and only after e6, then h4. Now, I mean, well, this pawn starts becoming very unpleasant like this. If you go knight f6, I guess we could consider jumping here. Maybe our bishop will go like this, and we will still sort of create pressure like that. I think we are borderlining a situation where there is no way for black to actually defend this objectively. I mean, sure, there is the Caro-Kann solidity, but while the Caro-Kann solidity is something I generally have a lot of respect for, you cannot just treat it as your only asset and keep everything else passive. And well, h4 is a very great way of trying to create weaknesses in the black camp. And well, when you create this kind of weaknesses, we will attack them, and when they defend, they will create weaknesses otherwise. Well, typical way of playing chess. I think game went something like this, now h5, and I think actually it finishes so quickly that we will just take the remaining moves. So bishop f4, something like this, and now I think, when is it in this position, Nogueras gets so tired of waiting that he plays the move b5, and after rook c1, there's going to be trouble in the c file, and well, the game was like this, and now knight e5, knight a7. Okay, I'm skipping this pass too quickly. I think basically black resigned because c6 is dropping. Okay, sorry about the latter stage. It was a little bit rushed, but I think it's nice enough to have the moves, else you can go over them in the move trainer and so on and so forth. I think the big lesson is mainly that, I mean, I find it fascinating that a position like this can actually be so promising for white, right? What one should see here is the lack of possibilities for black, that here space matters. And you would maybe even argue, isn't it only a moderate space advantage? But no, it is quite considerable, and it makes a major difference here. And we saw how, I mean, well, the pawn on h3 is useful, right? Somehow black doesn't manage to quickly exchange a set of pieces, quickly to undermine with, let's say, c5 or e5, and somehow white managed to keep the position from a structural point under control. And well, soon we saw something like this, when it becomes very evident that white is so much better. And this position is easy for me to understand logically, right? This is just, well, everything is in white's favor. White is clearly better. But the previous position here, I think this requires tremendous skill to sort of grasp that, no, white is much better here because black lacks a reasonable way to sort of get out of this strategical bind. And I think some it is, yeah, having four pieces, lack of sort of, well, four pieces clouds, four minor pieces, I mean, clouds the situation in terms of which one is going where. You would like to have some exchange, you would like to release with a pawn break, but I'm kind of repeating myself. So I think, I hope you have grasped the position by now. Thanks. We are switching from e4 to d4 structures here. Here we have a sort of quite typical Catalan position, but it just goes to show that Caro-Kann structures can happen from any kind of opening sort of setup, and also that I mean, well, by extension, of course, understanding the Caro-Kann structure has a lot of general chess relevance. It's not at all limited to if you have an interest to the Caro-Kann. Here, At first sight, maybe it can look like black has done pretty well. I mean, normally this bishop on d6 would be on e7. And, well, you could make the case, why isn't it more beautifully placed on d6 than on e7, right? It looks more active. Actually, that is deceptive. There is a reason why they put it on e7 more often. And in this position, Ivanisevic plays a very instructive move. He plays the move knight to d2. Well, at first sight, it looks, well, if you had the knight on d2, you would almost consider putting it on f3, right? f3 looks like a better square. But, of course, the point is that he wants to play the move e4 and open up for the bishop and also, challenge the white center. As a bonus, the knight on d2 protects the pawn on c4. It's not so simple for black to do something very useful here. I mean, a typical way of developing would be something like b6, but that very much runs into e4 now. Also, a slight inconvenience of having the bishop on d6 is that when white goes e4, you cannot just ignore it because there's the threat of e5 winning a piece. Ascic tries to sort of counter this concept by just sort of being solid. But as we saw in the first two examples here as well, I mean, this just being solid is just not enough in this structure. You need to have some kind of positive counterplay. Here it's actually not Ascic's king that gets into trouble, but it's more from a purely positional perspective. I mean, well, Rougier, of course, has some idea of getting in e5, but white gets there first. So e4 happens. There is a threat of e5, and, well, there's also a threat to the pawn on d5. So black kind of has to react. There comes a swap like this. Now, maybe playing something like bishop c7 would be the lesser evil, but in general, white has just gotten to sort of develop in a free way and got more space. So the game goes knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop e7. And again, it becomes too passive, but I think it's important to sort of understand, well, what to do about this space we are granted, because space can be a temporary asset, and should black actually manage to set up undermining with c5, as is extremely typical in this Caro-Kann structures, things can end up not too bad. Bishop f4 is a nice developing move here, played by Ivanisevic. The concept is that should black play c5, well, quite often d5 will be the critical move, and it's also quite reasonable here. But that can sometimes lead to, I mean, a more double-edged structure. Here, Ivanisevic just have the option of taking on c5, knight takes c5, and then knight d6. And it's going to end up with an almost, I would say, winning positional advantage. One thing is getting the pair of bishops, but I would say even worse is that, I mean, this knight is in trouble, and white can, play for b4, c5, and this bishop is a beast, and this bishop is sort of very passively played. So here, white is basically borderlining winning already. So bishop f4, knight f6, well, trying to exchange knights. The next move by white is one of my general favorite concepts. And, well, the author says that as a young chess player, I was puzzled by moves like this, and I had the exact same feeling, I remember. Can you really play something like that that looks a-positional? Well, the move is c5. I mean, I really hope there is something in you that says, wow, this is ugly, because it really, really weakens the d5 square. But it matters less, because I think, I guess it was Fischer who said, well, to get squares, you have to give squares. And white simply makes the choice that, well, I think the d6 square is more important than the d5 square. At first sight, that is not so simple to me. I mean, I understand that both are sort of eternal squares in the sense that, well, on d6, there is no black pawn that can challenge it, and the same goes for the d5 square. There's no white pawn that can challenge it. But is d6 really more important than d5? Well, the answer seems to be yes here. I I mean, maybe black could even consider, let's say, exchanging on e4. Then there is nothing that enters the d6 square, right? But then the big problem becomes the bishop on c8 being tremendously passive, and white can just continue pushing on the queen side. It's almost automatic position. That's going to be extremely unpleasant for black. So it's no wonder that black tried to put this knight on d5. White is just going to ignore it for the time being. He starts by playing the move bishop to d6. Well, the d6 square, we really want to have a knight there. But to get the knight there, well, we ideally want to get rid of this one. So if we can swap these two bishops, it means the d6 square basically going to be ours, right? Games go b6, and then another nice move, queen to a4, sort of attacking this weakness. Black goes b5, but then we happily retreat because, well, we have lured the pawn to b5, which means that it can no longer undermine the sort of pawn on c5. Maybe still we are not there fully to grasp how promising this position is for white, but basically it's strategically winning. Part of it is space advantage. I understand that these pawns perhaps looks blocked, and we can still, we see this picture there, this knight on d5. And the reason I said picture is that there is this saying that it's pretty as a picture. It looks nice there, but it's not supported by the rest of the army. And the sort of hole on d6 we'll see appearing is very, very relevant, while this one on d5 is temporary and not that relevant. Game goes a5, rook e1, bishop f8. Then exchange happens, knight to d6. Okay, it's overwhelming, and we could have stopped, but there is just one more incident I really would like to show. So, okay, bishop e4, h6, creating a small weakness, queen d2, bishop d7. I think we have reached the situation now, yes. When comparing two beautiful knights like this, what is a key factor? Well, a very massive factor is, are they permanent? Well, in terms of they cannot be attacked by pawn moves, they are both permanent. But, I mean, white can actually take the knight on d5, while here the bishop on d7 will never be able to challenge this knight on d6. Of course, well, white had a bunch of options to take on d5, but you don't want to do it immediately. I think, well, it's a general saying that an advantage over bishops versus knight is that sometimes the bishop has to choose, or has the option of choosing, of taking the knight at some point. And now the sort of timing is excellent, as is described well in the book, that now after bishop takes d5, suddenly, well, white is organized well enough to actually carry out this exchange. The point is that if you take the e-pawn, keeping symmetry, it seems very logical. Then after rook to e5, well, basically, we are ready to take over the e-file. This knight on d6 beautifully blocks the e8 square, so black cannot start opposing. And basically, well, a position like this, I think the author describes as basically winning for white, right? We will, end up with a rook on e7 at some point, or maybe we prepare f5 to cramp it even further. I mean, the difference between our strong knight and their bishop is basically more than enough to win a game of chess. It's extremely telling in sort of difference of power and usability. It's more or less the same as power. But the knight on d6, apart from being very strong by itself, it also controls the e8 square, right? So after bishop takes d5, black took back with the pawn. But now, well, rook c1 threatening c6 perhaps, but luring the queen to c7, and a very nice move g4. You can argue it weakens the king a little bit, but this king, I mean, it's so safe anyway because we have space. There's absolutely no black pieces here. It doesn't matter. But at some point, we might start opening lines on the king side. Even, well, a rook can go to c3 and g3 now, etc. and such. But, well, black protects with f6, but after f4, b4, f5, basically it forces the e line open. And again, because the knight protects this square, we can just double in the e-file and wait on e7. And, well, this is getting too far from our general theme, but I thought it's a great chess game, sort of in general with some nice details. Running back, I think here I really like the move knight d2. Maybe it's sort of Catalan specific that you try pushing for e4 here. And then when we get to these things again, I think, well, it's yet another sort of disclaimer of solidity is not enough in this structure. You need to have some kind of plan how you somewhat release the pressure, either by having exchanged several set of minor pieces or pushing through c5. And of course, well, whenever I get a chance, I would like to speak about this c5 move, because for me, it's a very beautiful positional theme. I mean, it's beautiful in terms of that there is this illogic in allowing actually a knight to jump to this very beautiful square. But one square is not necessarily enough. And it's a theme that, as like the author, it was so puzzling to me that it stayed there as a passionate image that I'm very happy to talk, here about 30 years later. So I hope it's something that, well, you found useful on a number of levels, but even if it's not only about the Caro structure, then this c5 trick and this idea that a knight like on d5 can be beautiful, yet not be the defining factor, I hope you also took with you. So a little bit here and there, but overall a lot of interesting points, I hope. An interesting model game here. It's Holt against Kamsky. And well, Kamsky basically is sort of a huge fan of this very solid structure and has played a lot of great games like this. I mean, Kamsky in his youth was a world championship candidate. He had two candidates matches against Anand. One he won, another one he lost. At that point, there was a split in sort of world championship cycles. So in the FIDE segment, he got as far as a world championship match against Caro, which he ended up losing. Then Kamsky took a considerable break from chess. He decided to have a medical career instead, but then ended up going back to chess. But when he came back to chess, of course, well, your knowledge will be somewhat outdated, your theoretical knowledge especially. So basically, Kamsky took the approach of being a very, very solid player and somehow chose to try and outplay his opponents later than in the actual opening stage. And one of them was being an expert in this kind of Caro structure. Well, for him, it would actually come via the Slav most often, like in this game. But Kamsky would have this very solid base, but then act from there. And he's really a master at that. At first sight, I guess, well, it's easy to praise Black's position for being solid, right? But it still does look like, well, isn't White slightly better here? Pieces in the right squares. Okay, the rook on d1, maybe we would rather have them on e1 and d1, but that's more or less also it. Can Black really start attacking right away here? Yes, actually he can, or at least attacking from a structural perspective. A part of it is perhaps that this knight on d7 is actually quite cleverly placed. We saw it a bit in the first example of the structure, where Black put the knight on f6 too early, but we mentioned that Karpov was keeping it at d7 because it kept some kind of flexibility in terms of, yeah, we would like to kick this bishop at some point, but only when the moment is right. And having postponed doing it with knight means that Kamsky actually can do it with the pawn. So Kamsky plays this nice move f5. Sure, it threatens the bishop, it has to go back, and then immediately comes the other move c5. So you can see that Kamsky is using his pawns to really undermine the white center. So now basically the white central edge is about to be removed. And this is kind of really what one would think is the black dream scenario in these kind of structures. Actually, when I see this position, I think, yeah, okay, classic example. Of course, Black is already better. There's a threat of bishop takes f3, which would cripple the pawn structure. And I think it's quite typical that some structures you would tend to overestimate because they are often played between players of different strengths. It's typical that when you get in, both f5 and c5 like this, White has missed something, which typically indicates that black would be the better player. And this leads to that, on average, black would play the remainder of the game better. And due to that, we will get a slightly biased idea of this structure. And, well, this is the case here. I take it as completely natural that black is going to win here. But actually, there's absolutely nothing wrong with white's position. A typical way to go about it would be d5. But here, things are, I would say details are much in black's favor. For a start, white is really not set up for this kind of attack. Secondly, as I pointed out, this rook on e8 is very useful. That, well, there's no direct threat on e6, and should there be an exchange, the e-file will open up. The book mentions bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, queen f6. I would say a very nice way to completely get rid of any kind of white initiative. And the point is that should you check like this, then, well, white is going to be left with bad sort of isolated pawns. The knight will jump to f4, and black is going to have a considerable edge. So after c5, as I said, my instinct is white is already very much sort of under pressure. It's not the case at all. Holt does it very beautiful. He plays the move bishop e2. Can look like a retreat, but it's just covering the knight here from f3, so it can't be immediately taken. And there is also, I mean, opening up some tension in the d file with the queen being here. So the black queen gets out of the way. Holt takes on c5, and Kamsky takes back with the pawn. This is also part of this typical narrative that ends up extremely well for black. Black is building a lot of potential here. I mean, he takes towards the center, and especially this pawn is now keeping the d4 square under control, which means that black has the threat of putting the pawn on e5 and then on e4, and then really pushing the white knight backwards. And there is little white can do to combat that from a sort of obvious strategic perspective. Okay, there's an exchange on g7 and queen d2, and that is a very, very nice move. It wins a little bit of time by attacking the knight here. Kamsky does rook to e7. And I have to admit, the next move really hats off for Holt. It must be a difficult move to make. I mean, this whole Jezebel course, the original book, it's about pawn structures. And, well, if you look at the white pawn structure here, we have a beautiful pawn structure, right? Pawns sort of defend each other's. Everything looks harmonious. But he plays the move b4. I mean, it looks so ugly, right? It transforms a perfect pawn structure into soon two isolated pawns. And, well, you know, almost even worse after the logical move e5, takes on c5, takes back. I mean, black gets this beautiful knight, and white is going to have a backward pawns behind it. It basically goes against a lot of positional principles. Why am I praising Holt? Well, of course, because the computer says I should. And it's really been a learning experience for me, because at sight, it looks like just black is outplaying white here. But actually, not at all. Queen a5 is the starting point. It attacks the knight. And while you can argue that, well, white do have weak pawns, you can also make the point that black has, I wouldn't say weak pieces, because weak minor pieces, because these pieces are well placed in terms of what they do. But in terms of being protected, they are somewhat vulnerable, right? I mean, this knight on c5, it's floating a little bit, and this queen is attacking it in a clever way. And a rook will come to b1 at some point eventually, and this bishop is also going to feel vulnerable. So it's an interesting way that Holt is doing it. He's actually acting immediately and in due time before black managed to consolidate. And it's very, very unusual. Kamsky goes rook c8, obviously defending his knight, right? And now perhaps even the better move would have been to play rook to d8 to check in this position. And after takes, queen f8, the next move is extremely important. there's no way that white should go for sort of refugee in an endgame. On the contrary, that would mean that this knight stabilizes on a5. Suddenly, there's no reasonable way to attack it. Maybe we will bring the king to the queen side. Maybe we will bring it to f6. And at some point, we will start advancing our pawns in the center. Immediately, black gets a stable advantage. Now, taking queens off would be very wrong. The correct move is, again, queen to a5 and keeping this pressure on the knight here, but also what I'm trying to explain is that this pawn chain, it's beautiful, but it also has the problem of it leaves the black king somewhat vulnerable. Not in the immediate sense, but when white sort of black starts pushing forward, he will always have to worry about his king. And I mean, it looks nice in a structural sense for black, but I think this knight, this bishop, and to some extent the king, they are lacking some kind of safety, and white will be able to harass it very well. And no, I thought it's very interesting, and it's nice to have this example in a course about pawn structures, that not everything is pawn structures. And this is it's a very peculiar example that definitely sort of tickles or annoys my intuition, because I believe so much in the value of pawn structures, but in this one it seems to be quite an exception actually. Anyway, sorry, the game was rook to b1. Kamsky went back like this, and now again another nice concept from Holt. He just transfers the knight like this to b3, and again, I mean, well, sure, white has a weak pawn on c4, black has strong pawns in the center, but challenging this knight on c5, somehow it ends up with the white rooks being very active in a way. If you start exchanging on b3, we're not going to take back with our pawn. I think really we're going to take back with our rook and try and sort of use the activity you will find on the 6th rank. We're going to keep sort of being as annoying as possible to the black pieces. So Kamsky after knight b3 chooses to drop back like this, and another good move, the move c5. It's the bishop is going to go to c4. It's going to stare towards the direction of the king here, and I think this is sort of till now this would be a typical game where the best player is going to win, and maybe that's what happened. What I mean is that both players has options. Both players are playing very well. And we are just talking about one mistake, and it's going to tip everything in one direction. Well, as Holt loses the game, it's tempting to sort of defend him, because he's actually doing very well. I think if anything, this game shows the general structure that black is trying, or the general pattern that black should play here, but it also shows very much how it should be combated, and Holt is doing it very well. Anyway, e3, a very strong move by Kamsky. I think Kamsky understands that, well, bishop was coming to c4. I am actually the one who is under pressure. I have to react very quickly. So Kamsky makes sure that not only the king on g8 is vulnerable, but certainly also the king on g1. And he does it by, he is ruining his own pawn structure. The pawn chain like this was beautiful, but like white playing b4, here black plays e3, because he need to have space to attack. You cannot always just care about things being visually beautiful. So Holt takes, queen takes back, queen d2, defending the weakness like this, and now it becomes a little bit of a blurry process. Rook c to d8, queen goes back. Of course, you can take the pawn like this, but then after queen f2, somehow it stabilizes. So Kamsky tries to keep the tension. Bishop d5, white takes the pawn, rook to a8, and now white makes a blunder. He plays bishop b5, and I think after rook takes a2, he sort of ends up going down in flames. There is an attack over here. The right move would have been bishop to f1. And after rook takes a2, the author thinks black is doing fine, but the computers sort of nowadays says rook c1. Actually, not at all. It attacks the rook. The knight goes to d3, and it starts, it keeps creating some kind of havoc against the the black pieces. I think discussing details like here misses the point. It has been a very, very complicated and messy games, but I really want to highlight both the starting position, because here I think we get a great example of the potential of black structure, that you not only stay solid, and we have seen that staying solid for too long or being only focused on solidity doesn't work so well, but that there is potential by f5 and c5. You start undermining, you create threats like on f3, you sort of start dissolving the space advantage by challenging it. But also, I think in chess terms, the main move for me is this beautiful move b4. I mean, this is just... it's really understanding of pawn structures, and well, it's understanding also of the lack of pawn structures. That, well, I keep saying that, we know that pawns are the soul of chess, and that pawn structures is very much the thing that defines how we look at the positions. But sometimes they have to be broken, and this is, for me, it's a very impressive move, because it's so counterintuitive, it's so ugly, but it's so very justified defending. Depending on the circumstances here, and the ability to actually, I think what you really ideally want is to have this great understanding of pawn structures, but also to have the courage to go against the general principles when you have to. And I think this is a great example of it, although that Holt in the end goes down. But I really hope it was an interesting example, and you saw a lot of pros and cons here. So hope you enjoyed it. We're going to look at a position from the anti-Maran, and we're going to have a game here between Schlosser and Luc van Wely. But there is a lot of similar games like this. But, well, I'm happy to talk a little about Luc van Wely. He's a very interesting Dutch player, quite charismatic, had a long chess career, but then, well, he switched to politics for a while. Now he's sort of back to chess coaching. He's crossed 50 by now, and he's considerably less active as a player. But Luke was sort of basically sub-world elite at a point, but mainly, I mean, he's Dutch, so he got to play quite some big tournaments, and well, when you get sort of as the local player into these big events, you end up playing some very, very strong guys. So there is a lot of famous games where he loses to Kasparov in the night of, but that's very typical for Luke's character. He's always willing to fight, and even playing Kasparov, he would be principled and play his mains openings, and well, that would go wrong, but it would be extremely interesting. My rivalry with Luke is mainly on the football pitch. As I said, we both went into chess coaching, and in Weigernsee, on the first free day every year, there used to be a football match, Team Magnus against Team Van Wely. And, well, I had to play on Magnus's team, else, well, if I injured Magnus, that would be kind of not too good. But injuring Van Wely, well, would be less bad. And me and Luke, we would always go very hard to each other, but in a friendly manner. He's a very fun competitor. He will give everything on the pitch, in football, on the chessboard, but he will be quite friendly afterwards. So we have a very interesting football rivalry on the pitch. In chess, well, he was better than me, but I got to beat him a couple of times. But that will be for a separate subject. Here, we're going to see him shine. Generally, I mean, as I said, he's very uncompromising, and you will see it here as well. Schlosser has just played the move e4, and well, it's a typical move. It has the threat of e5, so basically black is kind of forced to take on e4. Luke, a typical expert, he knows how to deal with these things. He takes with the knight. Well, it might look like it doesn't matter, and maybe it does not, but after d takes e5, white gets this extra option of knight to g5, and recapturing later, and then there's going to be a knight on e4 instead of a queen, and that's perhaps slightly to white's advantage. So why give this option? So knight takes e4 is a nice little finesse. Knights will be exchanged, and the queen will get to e4. I mean, this kind of structures we have spoken of before. At some point in other games, the king turned out to be quite vulnerable here, and Well, would white get the time? Probably he would be happy to put some kind of attack like this and start aiming for the king. In the previous examples, I tried to mention that having a knight on d7 was quite flexible in terms of, have you played knight f6 immediately, you will force the queen to a good square, and you kind of have released your potential, while waiting seemed to be a better strategy to do it at the moment of your choice. But here it seems to be a good time to do it immediately. Well, one point is we can't really play f5 because something is just going to drop on e6 and even the bishop would fall next. So Van Wely plays the move knight to f6. This is also quite reasonable in terms of what black really wants to play. Is the next move is c5. And at the moment the bishop would be hanging, but when this queen is dislodged, we can just play c5. So queen h4 happens. And black chooses to play the move c5 then. This, well, it threatens on f3, but we can see the bishop is capable of taking back. So while in the previous game, playing the move c5 actually was with sort of tempi due to the threat of f3, here it's not. But can white sort of exploit it? Not really. Well, I will still keep black's main threat as a secret. So, but there's not much you can do as white here. You can take on c5, but I mean, we can take back probably more or less with any piece. But if you take on f6 next, well, we're just going to take with the queen. And should white double the pawns, well, we get the pair bishop as a compensation. That's not really a problem. Rook a d1 was the move he played in the game here, and that's extremely logical, right? We are trying to create tension in the d file, exploit that the rook is now sort of ghosting the queen a little bit, and trying to create some kind of discomfort, and maybe d takes c5 is already a threat. But black's next move is it's maybe not essential, but it's extremely instructive. And maybe for some it would look like a draw offer, but not at all. Not only because it's Van Wely who's black. It's actually sort of in this structure that when this happens, things can easily tilt in black's favor. And that's very much what happened in this game. So Luke plays the move knight to e4. It offers an exchange of queens, but I mean, well, the white queen has gone from, I think, from d1 to c2 to e4 to h4, while black's queen is standing still there. And after this exchange, well, then black even gets to develop the rook. So somehow black is gaining some speed, some momentum like this. This is what happens in the game, but it's already at minimum an inaccuracy, and black is very much starting to put pressure now. I think the most realistic move for white was to keep the queens on the board. Somehow put the queen on h5, and well, it becomes kind of an outpost. If black should sort of start with g6, we already have queen h6, and there starts to be some kind of threats in that direction. So the queen would be a little bit annoying on h5. I mean, we are not talking white being better or anything. We're talking about white trying to defend in the most reasonable way. I think the book suggested, well, black would have to take on d4, and after something like bishop takes d4, queen e7, black would play f5 next, and actually would be doing quite well. This queen is somewhat out of play, but it's not particularly disaster at all. But in the game, after queen takes d8, rook takes d8, it's already unpleasant for black. It's difficult to find useful moves. I mean, well, you could do something like rook f2 e1, but after c takes d4, I mean, you can see the bishop either going to c5 attacking in the direction of the weak pawn on f2, or even on b4 gaining a tempo attacking the rook. This is unpleasant. And it's typical that these kind of things happens, that there's nothing wrong with the white position. White has more space, but if the sort of aggressive intent is not there, one tries to be too solid, and it can very easily sort of snowball small disadvantages that actually becomes rather major. And this is exactly what happens here. Schlosser plays the move knight to d2, trying to make further exchanges. Lux takes it and takes back, and now perhaps his best move of the game. I think a a very, very nice maneuver. It would be logical to play the move bishop to f4 attacking the rook, but then the rook can just slide back and things are kind of under control, and next maybe white will take on c5 and then start exchanging rooks in the d files, and things are not too bad for white at all. That would most likely lead to a draw. But Van really does it in a much more cunning way. He plays the move bishop to e5 first. This threatens just to win the pawn on d4, and well, obviously you can't take like this because there is rook takes d2. So after bishop e5, there's actually considerable pressure. There's not much to do. You have to go rook f to d1 because you're protecting your rook on d2 and you're starting to threaten here. And well, should he take on d4, you can just swap everything and have perfectly fine position. But Van really does it much more clever. He plays the move bishop to f4, and he's simply exploiting that, well, white put his rook on d1, so now this rook on d2 cannot go back to d1. The rook has to slide to c2. If rook d3, then bishop to e4 is quite clever. Then maybe, you could play something like rook h3, or you were forced to, but moves like bishop to c2 starts appearing. This rook is getting removed, and then we can take on d4 next. So after bishop f4, Schlosser chose to go rook to c2. Then another strong move, bishop to e4, it forces the exchange, and after takes, just a move rook to d7. It puts tremendous pressure on the d4 pawn, right? We want to put our rook to d8 and just basically pin him down. Well, what I'm trying to show here, that could you play rook c2 to d1, things would be fine. But because we have this strong bishop on f4, this rook on c2 is very, very uncomfortably placed. The game went g3, bishop went to e5, and Schlosser, well, doesn't want to lose a pawn in the d file. Rook f8 rook c d8 would be next, has to play the move d5, and now there is an exchange like this, takes, and a very nice move, king to f8. Black is just considerably better here. The problem is this pawn on d5. It's not a strong passed pawn. It's a weak isolated pawn. I think we spoke about it in the Isolani chapter. Then endings very often favor the one playing against the Isolani. And we had some queen and rook endings here. It's a double rook ending, and it's just better for white. Basically, well, we will see how he's actually executing. This is just a defensive move, and rook to e8, king g2, and the next move is very, very good from Luke. He plays king to e7. He basically, well, given the chance, he would be happy to go to d6 and block the isolated pawn. That white cannot allow, so he gives a check, and well, it could be with the d pawn, but it could also be with the rook like here, and then the king drops backwards like this. So basically, the king has entered d8, where it's closer into the vicinity of the d pawn, and well, white has this unpleasant choice. Should he allow an exchange of rooks, or should he start well, deploying his rooks passively back in the d line? But then the king has gotten closer to the action. Luke sort of goes king f3, perhaps insinuating if he takes on e3, he might take back with the f pawn, sort of that the isolated pawn will not really be there anymore. But Van Wely just plays like this, h4, and he moves forward with the king, and the king goes up here. And the computer already said black is just winning here. There is maybe ideas like rook e5, starting to attack this pawn, but maybe also sometimes just b4 and b5 and c4, and white is in huge trouble here. Well, what am I trying to show here, except for praising Van Wely for playing a great game? I guess if we go back to this position, it's hard to talk of white danger in a way, but the scenario we saw, I mean, I can come up with several games that has a similar pattern, that, well, white gets this spade's edge, but black has made a comfortable exchange, and he starts finding the potential on the king's side. I mean, sometimes it would even be with f5 as shown. But here, I mean, an even more common thing, this idea of c5 and then the move knight to e4. And well, this is a maneuver. There is a bunch like games like this, and black comfortably equalizes, and the narrative would, I mean, or I would say the momentum would typically go very much in black's favor. So I think this is a key concept to know as black. As white, you have to understand that, well, you don't just make a draw by starting to swap things. No, on the contrary, you can end up in a very unpleasant structure, I would argue. So I think this is really common knowledge for a lot of strong players, this kind of strategy we've seen here. And well, I think it's a good example the author included in the book. So the final game of this Caro Kann structured chapter is quite fittingly an actual Caro Kann. It's a game between Svaginchev and Yodokimov. Well, we see the structure, right? Pawns like this, and white has a center like this. Generally, black is quite solid, and well, I think the main thing that defines things for me is that, well, black has quite comfortably gotten his bishop outside of this pawn chain, right? If the bishop was on c8, we would very much consider it a bad bishop. But on g6, it's placed very healthily and solidly. And that's kind of why, I mean, black has a completely fine position here. We're looking at it from the white's perspective in terms of it's white who ends up on top. But this position is just perfectly fine for black. I've spoken sometimes about that having 4 minor pieces kind of hinders the defending side. But when you got your bishop out of the pawn chain, when it's not sort of easily attacked in any way, I think that sort of overrules. I mean, the problem is having too many pieces inside this kind of fortress area. When you have them outside, well, things are considerably different. Then you don't suffer from that they are tripping over each other. And we don't have to spend energy liberating a bishop on b7 because it's well placed on g6. Having said that, of course, well, what should we do then? In the game, black plays queen a5. I'm not a huge fan. One typical move would just be to put the queen on c7. Then we're gonna put rooks most likely on d8 and e8, or maybe rook f to d8 is also a possibility. Basically, we are gonna be solid, and we will make some useful moves. Put the rooks more centrally, maybe put the bishop back on f8, and see what's gonna happen. Basically, we will trust our structure to be solid, and maybe even at some point we will get ready to play the move c5. But, I mean, it's not like black can play for an advantage here, but playing a little bit more aggressively is also an option. The move I like most, I would say, is the move a5. It's very typical. You want to play a4 next if undisturbed, and that would be a little bit unpleasant for white, right? I mean, having a pawn on a4 gives black some space. I don't know, I'll maybe make a random move like this, a4, and then, well, the queen could come to a5 next, and it feels like the tension moderately favors black. So after a5, I guess, well, a4 you don't want to play because of the weakness of the b4 square. The typical move would be a3. But then we could put the queen on the b6 square, and, well, of course, it's not like b3 is lethally weakened, but it's a little bit unpleasant. You can't sort of freely move your queen to e2, right? So I think like that, black just gets a completely perfectly acceptable position. In the game, Yodokimov plays the move queen to a5. It's not like I don't get the idea. He wants to play bishop a3 and start exchanging also the dark squared bishops, and then things becomes even more, I would say, trivially solid for black. I think basically, well, we have slightly less space. Exchanges are going to favor us moderately. But now Svaginchev plays the move a3, and well, dropping back to b6 with the queen, attacking the b3 pawn, that was much more comfortable when we had a pawn on a5 already. So here he goes rook f to d8, rook e1 happens, and it's not like there is anything particularly wrong with black's position. It's still very solid, but now it feels like a little bit more pleasant for white, right? I think especially this queen on a5 strikes me as a little bit misplaced. Of course, well, you could just put it back on c7 and say, okay, sure, I played it a little bit inaccurately, but there's not that much white can do about it. If you play b4, very often you end up getting undermined like this, right? So, I mean, no big harm. But Yudakimov wants to play it more interestingly. He takes on d3 and then plays the move b5. This is also quite typical, actually, because black would like to perhaps exchange, and when he takes back with the b pawn, we can put the rook in the b file. Also, well, sometimes I want you to play c5, but here it's really just weakening this square, because white doesn't get anything in return. It's just black who gets a nice square. So c5 is also kind of unpleasant. So there is a lot of logic to that. If anything, you could argue it's quite an ambitious concept. And Swagenchev, I think, understands that you cannot just start, let's say, waiting. If he takes on, well, taking on b5 is weird generally, but you might even take back with the queen. I think maybe a more relevant line is suggested here, that should you, in this position, play the move b4, black will take on c4 and takes back, then this nice move queen to b5. White cannot really exchange, then black just prepares his pawn structure immediately. But after, let's say, rook to e to c1, there is this very nice move a5, which starts breaking down the white structure, and black is already pleasantly better here. Again, this d5 square has become available, and even, let's say, if all the 4 pawns on the queen side gets exchanged, it's gonna end up pleasant for black. So Swagenchev realizes after b5, I'm actually in some kind of danger here, and plays it very nicely. He plays the move knight to f5. This is also a typical theme in the Caro Kann, because this bishop on e7 is unprotected at times, and then there is this kind of moves. Yudakimov just goes back, and then after bishop f8, the knight goes to e3. This helps quite some structurally. We can see in the game that it goes wrong for black. I think he plays rook b8, queen goes to c2, and then after takes queen b5, b4. The major difference to b4 is that, well, black cannot play the move a5, and this basically means that this structure becomes very sad for black. Of course, the knight will go to d5, and the square is going to be the knights. But, well, we can see how the game progresses. It comes in like h6, bishop c1, actually, knight d5, bishop to d2. And after a while, white gets this very strong knight here. And while the structure is somewhat weird in terms of both have an isolated, somewhat weak pawn, I would say the problem is that this pawn on c6 is very vulnerable, while this pawn on d4, it doesn't really matter. It's of course, it's an isolated pawn, but it's a considerably minor problem that the pawn on c6. And here, well, basically, black has been structurally outplayed. I think the key sort of problem was in this position. Actually, the computer says you should take on c4, and after knight takes, then queen b5 is right, and if b4, you can do the move a5, and you exploit that this is not possible due to the queen is hanging. But anyway, this is kind of details, I think, maybe interesting details in this structure, but sort of the key takeaway is that I think a position like this is generally just considered very solid for black. Of course, should white get a hold on some kind of squares, like we saw the a5 square later, he was doing fine. But generally, black is supposed to be quite of okay, either in this solid way, but my preference was a little bit, I mean, more provocative, or sort of active, perhaps is the better word, to create a sort of a smidgen of counterplay, while at the same time having this extremely healthy position. Something like this strikes me as This is a more typical Caro-Kann position, well, it's a Caro-Kann structure position, because it's more equally balanced, that black is okay. I think what we saw was generally a lot of games with exceptions, that there was either very promising for white or quite pleasant for black in terms of immediate counterplay. This one is more, I would say, boring in terms of that black is completely healthy, but so is white. And that's maybe what to some extent defines the general characteristic, that it's a kind of balanced position. So I think it's good that we finish it off with sort of the balanced approach, while the previous game we saw the pros of cons, when things goes actually either very right or very wrong. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this chapter. Thanks a lot.